Hello, this is Uptalk from Chatelaine, and I'm your host, Rachel Giese. On this episode...
With us, it was like, oh, we must be deliberately trying to make money and sell records. And P.S., yeah. Why is success so gross when it's on a woman? It shouldn't be.
That was Canadian pop duo, industry veterans Tegan and Sara. Their latest record, which is their 8th, is called Love You to Death. We'll talk about the state of pop music, queering the mainstream, and sibling strife. My conversation with Tegan and Sara is coming up on Uptalk. But first, let's hear a bit of the lead single, Boyfriend.
Tell you that I love you, that I can't hold back. The feeling that you give me, wanna give it right back. I know you always win at this particular game. I need to know the rules if you want me to play. You treat me like your boyfriend and trust me like a very best friend. Kiss me like your boyfriend. Call me up like you were your best friend. You turn me on like you were your boyfriend, but I don't wanna be your secret anymore.
The 36-year-old Quinn twins from Calgary have been doing music professionally for more than half their lives. They started out as, quote, folk artists, but their music has certainly seen a natural progression. Their last album, 2013's Heartthrob, turned them from cult indie artists into bona fide pop stars. You probably still can't get their earwormy single, Closer, out of your head. But despite their success, they still maintain their DIY work ethic, small band approach, and introspective lyrics. Their 8th album, Love You to Death, which came out this past summer, has been called their biggest, strongest, and catchiest to date. And perhaps surprisingly, it's their most explicitly queer. Musically, Tegan and Sara have become more of who they are, and it's pretty terrific to listen to. Here's our conversation. Welcome to Uptalk, Tegan and Sara.
Hi. Hello.
Love You to Death is your 8th album, and it's terrific. And it's your biggest... Oh, you're welcome. It's your biggest dive into pop so far, even though that's been kind of the direction you've been moving towards. Does it surprise you at this point in your career to be two queer women solidly in mainstream pop?
Well, it's interesting first just to address, like, this is our biggest dive into pop. Like, I think we don't have that perspective only because we're in the midst of it. Even Heartthrob didn't feel like a big dive. That was our 7th record, and people made such a big deal out of the production. And it was only years later looking back, like most recently, and going, oh yeah, that was a huge jump, especially from Sainthood, which I think was such a live feeling record, and we didn't do a ton of overdubbing. So I think for us, like, Love You to Death just feels totally normal. It just feels like the next thing that we did. But yeah, I mean, to answer your question about waking up one day and feeling like we're a part of the mainstream or being accepted into the pop world, it feels really nice. It's quite refreshing. We felt like outsiders for a long time. But I think, we've been talking a lot about this in the last little bit. I think it's important to still identify that we are still a small band. I think we're making pop music. We are not pop stars. And it's funny, right. Like the headlines are so hyperbolic. It's like Tegan and Sara, pop stars. And it's like, yes, we came to this interview in a helicopter. It's like, no, I mean, we're still fairly, I would say we're still very much the same size band we've always been in terms of like production and crew and staff and even sales, but I do think we have an enormous reach now, and I think we are reaching more people. We just aren't entirely sure what that means yet.
Right. Well, I mean, it's interesting because your path is not a typical one, I think, for a lot of female pop stars where, you guys were doing more of a DIY indie approach from the time you were teenagers and really built yourselves as musicians, as performers, built the business of your career. So this isn't sort of an overnight jump into being artists. This has been the result of almost 20 years of working together. Sara, do you think that made a difference in terms of the pop direction, sort of having had that history behind you?
We're making music that fits under the umbrella of pop music, but we're not always making that music the way other people make it, and we're not always approaching our touring career or the marketing of our band in the way that other people do in the pop world. And probably that just comes from spending 17 years in a sort of indie rock DIY mentality. I wasn't upset with that side of the business. I actually really liked being hands-on. I was never like, let's move into pop music so we can do less of what we like. I was like, let's move into pop music so we can reach new people and talk to new people. And it's also important here, I'll interject, Sarah, sorry to interrupt, but it's also important, you said DIY, and the early part of our career was like that, but we've always been on a major label. Right. We just were, as Sarah said, we were very much like we were our own insular world, and we just didn't let anybody in. And everyone kind of just let us get away with that.
And where did that come from, that kind of confidence to actually to say, we're going to do it our way? Like, you're with a major label, but you decided that you were still going to chart your own path. Because I think, you guys started out so young. And again, like for a lot of particularly female artists, the first album comes out and it's very packaged and it's very much produced by a producer, and it's their vision, not the vision of the artist necessarily. So where did that come from, that kind of confidence and that swagger early on?
I don't even think it probably was. I think it might have been the opposite of that. It might have been a lack of confidence, and it was sort of like, not like, I don't know. It's funny because it's like a bit of a remembering now, because I sort of feel like I'm making up a new interesting answer in recent months, but I remember the beginning of our career now almost through the lens of I think that I didn't want anyone to tell me what to do. I was moving out of my parents' house. I wasn't in high school anymore. I wasn't going to college. I didn't want to have anyone tell me what to do. I didn't like that, even though there were record companies interested in us and there were agents interested in us, there was a lot of excitement and activity around the project really early on. I found it suspicious and irritating.
We were skeptical.
Yes.
We would come home.
It was another authority figure who was going to replace school or replace parents. And I remember it being less about like, we don't want to sell out. It was more like, I don't want anyone to tell me what to do. I didn't want to be judged. I didn't want to be graded. I didn't want to be told this is the trajectory you should be on, because we were told that almost immediately. I mean, the second Tegan and I started playing guitar in a way where we were sort of opening ourselves up to feedback, we were given it all the time, and it was usually by older men. And those were the people who felt comfortable to come in and say, you should try playing these guitar chords, or you should try playing on a click so that it's more in time, or you should wear makeup when you're on television because it'll show off your features. I mean, those things irritated me, and I was already irritated, and I felt freedom by not being in school and not living in my parents' house anymore, and something about getting into a traditional record contract and having a lot of support around us just sounded like going back to kind of a place where we were imprisoned somehow.
Yeah. And do you think that was something you carried with you to the pop realm? Because again, I think that, your music has moved more towards a pop sound, and yet it's very introspective. It breaks a lot of the rules sometimes of mainstream pop in terms of, digging into like deep themes and saying big stuff with something that's really catchy and melodic and danceable, which that's not always the case in pop music.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's so hard, right? Because we're not really, it looks the opposite of what I'm about to say, but we aren't really trying to do anything. We're just making music that we really enjoy. And we grew up in the 80s and we like 80s music, and we had played acoustic guitar and electric guitar and had more of like an indie rock sound for over a decade. And we were entering our 30s and we were in such a cool spot. We had this really amazing, vibrant community. And it sounds silly to say, but in 2007, we collaborated with Tiesto, and the EDM world accepted us without question. There was no analysis. There was no, hold on a second, girls, before you get up in front of these 30,000 people at Bonnaroo. You're in the indie rock world. You're not allowed up here on stage in front of all these people. We just went, and everyone loved it. And we started to think, man, maybe we should play with our sound a little more. Maybe we should try pop. Sarah was bored playing guitar. We're both classically trained piano players. That was our first instrument. She started contributing more songs that were based on the piano. I wrote Closer very early on into the demoing process. Everybody liked it. It was catchy and hooky. It was kind of natural. We wrote all those songs for Heartthrob before we chose Greg Kurstin, before we chose a pop producer. It just kind of came naturally. There was no premeditated thing. And Sarah and I both just found pop music really interesting, starting with like Robin and Alicia Keys. It just started to get really... It was introspective. It was Sarah that sat us down in the van one day, I remember, and played The Dream for us. And The Dream, of course, is like a very famous producer who like wrote Umbrella. Okay, so just to give the people listening a reference point. And Sarah was like, don't you think it's so weird? The Dream put out a record of his own, and all the songs were like, forgive me, and about feelings and whatever. And Sarah was like, pop music is getting introspective, and it is getting really it feels very honest and reflective. And I think that really appealed to us as an emo, indie, folk, rock, whatever kind of band we were. We'd been called everything, but one thing that everyone could agree on was that we talked about our feelings. And when pop became kind of full of feelings, I was like, we were feeling that.
I mean, it wasn't even just feelings. It was sort of, I mean, this is like very broad. I don't think you could necessarily back this up across the board. But what I was listening to anyway was sort of representing almost a gender flip too of what was happening in indie rock. In a way, you know, the voice of certain female artists that I was listening to, like Alicia Keys or Robin or Beyonce, they were incredibly empowered, even when they were talking about being let down by people or being broken up with or whatever it was. There was something really powerful about that to me, and it really spoke to me. And I feel like Tegan and I have sort of always maybe been a bit off-putting to people in the indie rock and rock world, because as women we were very confident. Even when we were singing about broken hearts, we were doing it in a really loud way, maybe even what would be described as sort of a masculine way. And I think that actually really turned people off on a subconscious level. And I started to hear that more in pop music. And so I was, of course, like, oh, that's what I want to listen to. And men, you know, like Tegan brought up, there were certain men in pop music like Justin Bieber and The Dream, and they were almost singing, they were singing in falsetto, they were singing in voices that were more like what I remember from my childhood, people like Prince, and they were singing without fear that they didn't sound masculine. So then that was interesting to me, like to have men singing about what it would feel like to give a woman pleasure, like that was really new to me. And that you were definitely not going to find that in the indie rock. Like you were nothing against Wolf Parade. I was, for some reason, they're the band I just thought of, but you weren't going to hear like Wolf Parade singing about giving a woman pleasure in a way that felt very feminist. And so I don't know, I just was interested in what was happening in hip hop and pop music. And, you know, I wanted to say one thing too about, you know, lyrics. I think that one thing that it's one of the criticisms that people from our early part of our career, they'll say, oh, but the lyrics aren't as good or they're not as introspective. But I think
they say yours aren't?
Yeah. And
really?
And that was something that I really took personally, because I probably labored over our lyrics more than Tegan did. But I think, if anything, I feel a sort of embarrassment about how vague and sometimes opaque like early songs are. Like, what in the hell is Walking with a Ghost about? Like, I mean, I know what it's about, but why would you ever even have any idea about what that's about? I mean, it's like an abstract painting.
There's sexism, you know, or just it's that we question women always, everything they do. If we wear makeup, oh my God, why are they wearing makeup? You know, oh, they're playing more pop. Why are they doing that? We rarely ask men that. You know, actually, some of the people we really respect in the indie rock community, they've done the same thing we have. Look at that last Arcade Fire record. Fascinating. Very interesting. Stars, same thing. Metric. I mean, and I don't know. I mean, I read their press. It doesn't seem like anyone's really challenging them. They're in the studio experimenting and trying. And like with us, it was like, oh, we must be deliberately trying to make money and sell records. And P.S., yeah.
Or did, yeah. I mean,
why is success so gross when it's on a woman? It shouldn't be. And we just refuse. Honestly, I don't even worry about it. I literally spend 0 seconds a day thinking about it, because it's so stupid to me to think that anyone would question us for wanting to be successful. The only time it would be offensive is if we are compromising who we are. And we aren't. We've become more us.
And you've also, you know, been able to be more open about gender and sexuality in pop music, which again, I think, even though I think pop music and dance music, I mean, the world of pop and dance, I think, has been a world that's embraced, you know, people of different sexual orientations and gender expression. But I think that's, maybe where the subversion comes in a way too, that there's a, you know, so I wanted to ask you, was that intentional? You said earlier that the movement towards pop wasn't necessarily some sort of master plan. It's just sort of where you grew. But in terms of, you know, queering mainstream pop music, was that something that you thought about and said, we want to have, you know, we want to sing music that's unambiguous about two women?
I mean, it definitely wasn't a conversation that I had. I've always just written what feels really natural to me. I've never gone in with any kind of like directive from myself. And I sort of write what feels natural, and then I'll sort of actually send a lot of my songs to Tegan and my best friend Emmy. And Emmy is like much more of a sort of cerebral thinker, political person. And she would really be hard on me sometimes. She would be like, no one's going to know what you're saying here. Like, why don't you say something like this instead? You know, she would be really hard on me. But early on in my relationship with Emmy, I remember her saying, why don't you say she or her? And I just remember thinking back then, like, well, why? None of the guys that I listen to sing about she or her. Like, sometimes they do, I guess, but like most of the time it is you. Why can't I say you, just like all the guys get to say you?
You know what's weird is that I was just thinking about this on stage during soundcheck, but and how come you don't want me you do say she.
Well, I say she about the person the girl that I like. Like, yes, I've
You could read
defined-
into it for sure.
Yes.
But still, like, it was interesting because someone had
But we don't
said
have
to
to
us
go- we
recently
don't
that
have to
we
go-
don't use pronouns. But you did on the last record say she, and you also did.
Well, I did. We don't use pronouns to describe our significant others or the person. in
No,
the
but again, like
relationship.
it's open. Like, you know, like there's definitely been. I think we've always had an element of that in our music. But I agree with Sarah that it was more universal feeling. And
I just honestly, I just didn't think about it. And recently, I've thought about it only as an afterthought. Like when I was writing Boyfriend for this record, I wasn't like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to write I'm going to write a song about gender, and you know, I'm going to be playful with it. Like I just thought, you know, it's something I refer to myself as my girlfriend's boyfriend. I just do. It's like, and I do it as a reclaiming and a sort of thumbing my nose at something silly. I mean, clearly I understand that there's a sort of playing into these ridiculous stereotypes. Like when I take the garbage out and I come back and she says, "Oh, thank you, boyfriend," and we're joking. You know, we're joking. We're not trying to like hammer down these like stupid stereotypes about what a man does and what a woman does. But to me, it was a playful sort of affectionate thing that we would do, and I didn't even think about it when I was writing the song.
But I think even that, like, I think even showing that playfulness of queer relationships, which is something that we only tend to keep among ourselves, that doesn't actually get broadcast in the world, becomes something, you know, because I feel like if like, especially like, you know, like pop music of all stripes, I think for queer people, you have to kind of imagine yourself into the music in the same way that you have to kind of imagine yourself into a lot of like movies and whatever. And I think that just in changing the pronouns or offering that perspective, it's kind of forcing a straight audience to imagine themselves in something else.
You bring up a good point too, that I've never had to. I didn't ever know that was what was happening when it came to the straight voice, like heterosexual, you know, relationships in music. I've never had to say to myself, oh, let's see if I can imagine myself in this. It's like that's the only perspective I've ever, on, you know, a majority level, you know, been accustomed to. So I think you're right, and I think that's why if I was doing it. If I was not adding pronouns, it would have been a subconscious choice. I think I was just mimicking the heteronormative, you know, singer-songwriters in music that I had heard my whole life.
One thing though that you started with, you said that maybe that there was more confidence, and I will say, like, not to make it about me, but like the song that opens the record, That Girl, in the past I would have not said that. I wouldn't have said girl because I would have been really self-conscious about eliminating men. Like men who are listening won't be able to relate because I'm saying girl. And I think that we have progressed, whether we know it or not. I agree with Sarah. It is mostly a subconscious thing. But even for me to go as far as to finish the song and keep, like, when did I become that girl? It's like we wouldn't have done that in the past because we would have been afraid of being a chick band for chicks, you know?
Yeah.
Like these ridiculous limitations are already put on our band. We have fought against that by trying to be universal, by constantly saying no, we're for everyone, we were always doing that, which goes against how we grew up. Like, I mean, we were so influenced by the Riot Girl movement, and that was all about like girls to the front, right? And then we start making music, and it's all about like no, we're universal. We compared ourselves constantly to male iconic artists from the 80s, you know, Prince and Bruce Springsteen and Tom Petty. We always were showing. We refused.
Well, that's who we related to. I mean,
no, we related to it, but
really
we were listening to Ani DeFranco when we started our career, and that was the person that we called when we got offered a deal. Was we called the Righteous Babe record hotline, like, you know, to ask questions. Like, the truth is that, like, I think that whether we knew it or not, I think we actually did push down some of our female influences and by some of that stuff just without even, I don't think we did it intentionally. I think that we felt like we would be limited. We felt like we would be caged. We would be put into a special section for women. Yeah. And I think that we have grown more confident in 17 years. I also think that we're just digging deep and we're really starting to talk about things like in a really, really, really revealing way. And I think whether it's Boyfriend or Sarah talking about Marriage on Be With You or me saying, when did I become that girl on That Girl, I think we're starting to say, like, we're going to write about the things that move us, whether it relates to or not. I think we're in a culture or a moment in society and culture where we should be able to say that and have men stand in the front row and sing along.
Yeah. It's interesting when I think about, you know, Beyonce's Lemonade and how much she rooted it into a Black female Southern experience. Yep. And I think the surprise by, I think, some white fans, which is like, is this for me? Can I, like, am I allowed to connect to it? And
Sure.
of course you can. I mean, of course, anyone.
I feel like this is the record I relate to most of that's Beyonce's ever done because it
Yeah.
feels so intense and emotional and real and
Yeah.
and angry, and I like
yeah,
that.
and I think really rooted, like not, I mean, not sort of. I think often there's this that something like transcending your identity is seen as a good thing.
Yeah.
And I feel like what's so interesting about what she's done, and I think what you guys have done with the new album, is it's not about being universal. It's about being super specific and true to yourselves, which then actually becomes a universal thing in a way. It allows people to plug into something, I think.
Yeah.
It's interesting too because, you know, even just as we're talking about this, my brain is sort of firing off a lot of different thoughts. But you know, in not being specific, I also think that, and in mimicking a lot of the male artists that we grew up listening to, I don't know that I don't know if I was as specifically as Tegan was describing, you know, putting myself into a more universal box. I think probably it has more to do with my gender identity and who I attached to growing up. And I think I wanted to be like the men that I liked. It wasn't that I didn't love Kate Bush or Annie Lennox. It was weirdly like I did actually, I can remember as a small child imagining myself on stage singing Groovy Kind of Love as Phil Collins, not as Annie Lennox. You know, like I wanted to be a man. I wanted to be a boy. I wanted to be Joey McIntyre from the New Kids on the Block. So it makes sense to me that I would have mimicked.
We were like, Tiffany who?
Yeah, no, but I loved Tiffany, but I kind of like, I think probably like if I really get down to it, it's like I was admiring and sometimes objectifying women when I was listening to their music, or when I was sort of I don't know, counting them as something that I was inspired by. Probably Ani DeFranco and Sinead O'Connor are probably the only two women I can think of that to me were very masculine. And so I sort of did take them on more like I would with some of the male artists that I was listening to. But anyways, that's here nor there. But I was going to say about Boyfriend, one thing that has been an interesting reaction, this sort of transcendence of gender in songs, has often actually still just made us like for women. Like a lot of people have, it didn't matter how universal we were. It didn't matter how vague we were about what we were singing about. Now that we are singing so specifically, the interesting reaction to me has been from men. Straight men and gay men come to me all the time and tell me how relatable Boyfriend is. And I'm like, isn't it so interesting that once I've assigned myself officially a male gender, a man is able to say, oh, I really get that.
Yeah.
Oh, I've had that happen to me before.
Because it's kind of like the friend zone. Like in their world, it's kind of like the friend zone
They're
experience.
basically like, I have had two girls or two guys kind of play me around like that. I totally relate to your experience. But what is interesting to me is it's not even that they relate to the experience. They relate to me because I am calling myself male in the song. I'm a boy. I'm the boyfriend. And so finally these guys are able to come up and go like, I totally relate to you. And so it's interesting because for me, I think as a woman and as a queer woman, I've had 35 years of experience of putting myself into the experience of other people and doing that successfully. But for men, I think it is really unusual, gay men or straight men, like I think that it's unusual for them to put themselves into the perspective or, you know, into the shoes of someone who is not like them.
Yeah. One of the things that has also, in terms of introspection and in terms of going deep more recently in your music, is talking about the relationship between the two of you and some of the conflict you experienced. And I know that, Sara, that you wrote music about this. And I'm wondering what that experience was like to write about it and then have Tegan listen to the music that you wrote about what was going on between the two of you.
Initially, I was far more self-conscious about what it said about me than I was about what it said about us, because the songs are really, especially White Knuckles, that's to me about my identity and sort of like my evolution in figuring out who I was at a sort of stressful period of my young adulthood. And so I wasn't even Tegan plays a huge part in that because it was sort of our fracture and our estrangement that allowed me to finally sort of define myself as an individual, and so it makes sense that she has to be, a part of my my storytelling. So, I feel bad sometimes because I feel like it sort of puts our relationship in a very vulnerable place where it can be criticized or critiqued or exploited. And so I've been really sensitive about it. But yeah, so I mean, I didn't feel self-conscious that Tegan would hear it and be injured or be insulted. I think that we're both very sensitive about our relationship and not using
our conflict to exploit the band or to make the band seem more interesting. We've certainly seen decades of like sibling rivalries in bands, and I'm incredibly turned off by that. I don't think it's anybody's business, and I think it would have been a far more demented thing to do it when we were really going through these issues in our early 20s. Now at 35, when I think our relationship is really mature and adult, and any scraps we might have are, I think, probably more civilized than even like the sibling arguments or fights that my normal friends have with their siblings now. Like I think we've almost become like clinical with each other and trying to figure out our conflict, but it's easy to do it now because I don't feel like I have anything to resolve with Tegan.
We could give like a master class on how to get along.
Yeah, I don't feel afraid of it. If anything, like I said, I mean, I'm more sensitive to what it reveals about me and what it reveals about my sort of difficulties as a young person.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think the most interesting part of the songs, and I hope people don't overlook it. I mean, ultimately, we always want people to insert themselves and create their own meaning. So I don't want people to listen to 100 times or White Knuckles and think about our relationship. But if perhaps you are interested in knowing, the thing I think is that's most interesting is that it's Sara talking about a very, very important time in our lives where we were just starting to sort of get our bearings and starting to really feel like we were in a band. And there was this massive choice Sara made to move across the country and move away from me and to start to identify as her own person, and the struggle and the terror we felt when everyone around us was going, you must love your life and you guys live in your dream and it's so exciting and everything's going great. And meanwhile, we were like in hotel rooms screaming to the point of like, calling and threatening to quit and calling our managers and them having to come out and, break up these massive emotional, awful fights. And it was something but then we would get on stage and it would be like professional.
I mean, and also, a lot of conflict between any two people, even sometimes when I'm fighting with people, I know I'm wrong, there's a like sort of litigator brain where I'm like, but I will be right by the end, like I will get to the end of this. And even if I was wrong, you will understand, to a cellular degree why I was right though in being wrong. And I think that there's something about both of those songs that, the takeaway for me in both of those songs is that I'm admitting my own faults. It's not about highlighting what Tegan was doing wrong, because Tegan was wrong a lot of the time. But for me, those songs are both admissions of I'm taking responsibility for I disrupted that relationship. I was the one who instigated that break, and and my independence depended on it. And I think also we've spent years writing songs about how other people have injured us. I mean, we are masterful about telling other people what they've done wrong, but it is a whole other thing. There's a whole other life, and it's not because I didn't know the other side of it. I mean, I've spent a ridiculous amount of money on therapy. I know what I've done wrong. I just don't find it that interesting to write about it. And so to find just from a creative place to sing about what are your faults and the things that you've done wrong, it doesn't feel as good as singing about the way someone else wronged you.
Yeah. Sara, thank you so much. Tegan,
thank you. Thank you.
It was a pleasure talking with you.
So nice to talk to you.
That was my conversation with Tegan and Sara. Their latest album is called Love You to Death. And before we say goodbye, off the album, here's a bit of their latest single, Stop Desire.
I can't deny I'm begging for attention, dropping hints, hoping for some tension, getting tired of making all this racket, waiting on you to get your ass in gear. I didn't want to be so invested, played it cool and then I overdressed it. You were there, I was tired of this nonsense where you pretend you don't get me, feel me, want me, like me, love me, need me tonight. If you're for my fire, you can't stop desire. Oh, 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 stop desire. Oh, 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 I've tried, but you feel to my fire. You can't stop desire. Oh, 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 stop desire. Oh, oh, oh.
That was a little bit of Stop Desire from Tegan and Sara. And that's it for our show. Thanks for listening. We want to know what you think, so send us your feedback. You can follow us at Chatelaine on Twitter and Facebook for more info and updates. You can subscribe to Uptalk from Chatelaine on iTunes or Google Play. And if you like the show, and I hope you do, you can rate us on iTunes. Uptalk is produced by Rachel Matlow. The theme music is by Ralph. I'm Rachel Giese. Talk soon.